Here on set with Tamer Karmout, who's Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. Welcome again, Tamer. So, phase 2 should be underway tomorrow. Hamas has said it's ready. Israel says they're trying to seek common ground, but there is no sign of phase 2.
Yeah, because there is no good faith, Nick, and when it comes to these negotiations. I mean, just to remind your viewers, there was a breakthrough when Israel and Hamas signed on these 3 stages approach the last 2 days of Biden's administration. But now you have Israel again in violation of the principles of this agreement.
So they're reneging on it, basically.
Sorry?
They're reneging on it.
Yes, more or less. And at the same time, they still repeat the same contradictory goals, which they have more or less presumably dropped when they accepted to sign this agreement with Hamas, which should lead to the end of this war. Now they're again emphasizing on the need for Hamas to disappear from the scene, that there will be no end of war without Hamas disappearing from the scene in Gaza. And the thing is also the U.S. administration as well, Trump also is stuck to these goals, the same goals. So now this is why we see the Israelis are hesitant, or they have no interest to move beyond stage 1, which is over today officially, to get into stage 2, which tackles very critical issues, the full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, handing over the borders to the Palestinians, and presumably later on it will lead to the reconstruction of Gaza. So now the Israeli intentions are clear now. They don't want this. I mean, this deal they signed on, it doesn't serve their purposes. So now this is why they're retracting now.
So they don't want it. What about the Trump administration? Because they've said, and whether or not it's true in reality, they've said that Israel can do what they like and they'll back them.
But that's a problem. Yes, I mean, the U.S. is not a fair mediator in this process. Of course, obviously, it's siding with the Israeli side. And we all know Trump's position on Gaza. I mean, he wants to see Palestinians out, forcible transfer of all Palestinians from Gaza. But now...
He said that was just a recommendation.
Exactly.
Latterly, didn't he?
Exactly. But now we're all waiting also for an Arab counter-proposal in 3 days from now, which is, I mean, there will be a major Arab summit in Cairo where Arab countries will present a counter-proposal which more or less shows their commitment to reconstruct Gaza and to keep Palestinians inside their lands, in return for a political path, for a political project that ends the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. But the problem is we don't have a clear vision from the American side, and we have a very clear position from the Israeli side that they don't want to see any Palestinian Authority return to Gaza or Hamas in Gaza, so we're stuck, more or less.
Stuck, right. So how do we unstick ourselves? How does the Arab proposal find a way through that fog?
I think the Arab proposal will, I mean, we already, some elements of the proposals have came out in the media. They are committed to fully support Palestinians' resilience and reconstructing Gaza in return for Israeli commitment for a future Palestinian state. So once they put this proposal on the table, I mean, we'll have to hear back from the Israelis and the Americans. If Trump's administration is sincere and keen to resolve this conflict once and forever, then they have also to present their own vision of what's a political, end result for this conflict. What could it be? And it's yet to be heard from the American. I mean, whether this includes Gaza, the West Bank, a viable Palestinian state on the 1967 borders. We need to hear this commitment loud and clear for the Americans, but we are not hearing it yet. So.
All right, well, Tamer, we'll leave it there for the moment. Thanks very much, Tamer Karmout here in the studio.
My pleasure.
Let's take it on now with Eren Etzion, who's a former Israeli diplomat and former deputy head of the National Security Council. Joins us now from Mevaset Zion on the outskirts of West Jerusalem. Great to have you with us, Mr. Etzion. Thanks for joining us here on Al Jazeera.
Hi.
So, as we've just been discussing, as you've been listening, the second phase of the ceasefire expires today. What's your thoughts here? What's your sentiment about the hope for phase 2 coming into play?
Well, I would echo some of the things that were said in your studio. There is definitely no good faith, and certainly not on the Israeli side. The Israeli Prime Minister is doing everything in his power, both internally and vis-a-vis the Trump administration and the other mediators and so on, and on the ground in the various arenas, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, in Syria and Lebanon, to prevent the restoration of calm and end to the war and the release of the hostages, which is the clear will of over 70% of Israelis. So we have a prime minister that's acting in direct contradiction to the will of his own people, and he's doing it out of his own political, personal, sometimes criminal interests. That's
And
what's
so
going
what-
on.
To what degree,
Yeah, it's a,
Mr. Etzion,
it's
do you
a
think?
very clear, it's a clear material breach of the agreement, as was said. We should have been by now in the early stages of withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Philadelphia corridor, and Netanyahu's, and by another 8 days from now, next Sunday, if I'm not mistaken, all forces should have been.
Sorry, I just
should
want to
have
cut in there just for a second.
evacuated.
To what degree do you think
Yeah.
Benjamin Netanyahu cannot move on to phase two, or feels he cannot move on to phase two, while Hamas is so demonstrably armed and present? We saw that with the exchange of the captives on a regular basis.
Well-
What kind of impact has that had on the administration's thinking?
On Netanyahu's administration's
Yeah.
thinking, it's certainly, you have to differentiate between the real calculations and the real, shall we say, strategic goals that any prime minister and any Israeli administration would have been concerned about, and that's certainly one of them. And the political side and the very particular circumstances under which Netanyahu personally operates, which are very particular. But in terms of the so-called day after in Gaza and the governing authority in Gaza to replace Hamas, everybody knows that Netanyahu, again, did everything in his power from the very early stages to prevent any discussion of that, both internally in Israel. He forbade, for example, the Israeli strategic planning branch in the IDF to plan anything to that effect. And he forbade any cabinet discussions, even when his former, now deposed defense minister pleaded for it. So he is the one responsible for the fact that Hamas is still in control in Gaza. And some are taking it as far as saying that essentially he has some degree, at least, of a joint interest with Hamas in perpetuating this situation where Hamas is still in power, and Netanyahu can still claim, well, as long as Hamas is in power, there's really nothing I can do, and all we can do is go back to war, sacrifice the hostages, essentially, sacrifice more Israeli soldiers, and continue fighting on end. And he's trying to convince the Israeli public that now, under renewed leadership of the defense ministry and of the IDF, and most importantly, with full backing from the Trump administration, including for example, cutting humanitarian aid and committing all sorts of acts that the former administration, the Biden administration, forbade. Now, this time around, it will really be possible to completely defeat Hamas and create a new situation on the ground.
What
which
about
most military
the Trump
experts, of course,
administration?
disagree.
What do you think their position actually is beneath the rhetoric that we've been hearing from Donald Trump, which, as we discussed here in the studio with Tamer, is that, okay, Israel, you choose what to do and we'll back you. But does the Trump administration really want to see more conflict within Gaza?
I want to choose my words carefully, but I think Trump's policy vis-a-vis Netanyahu is totally misguided. He fails to realize that Netanyahu is the main obstacle to any kind of a ceasefire, cessation of hostilities, and ultimately the rebuilding of Gaza, the reconstruction of Gaza, which I believe President Trump is interested in, an end to the war and reconstruction of Gaza. He said it, and I think he means it. But for some reason, he was convinced that in order to do that, he needs to allow Netanyahu to breach the agreement, to prevent the move to phase two, to remain in Philadelphia, to renew the war, and so on and so forth. And he's completely misguided in that, unfortunately, and he's going to find it out. I hope it's not going to be too late.
All right, Mr. Etzion, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much indeed for joining us here on Al Jazeera. That's Aaron Etzion, former deputy head of the Israeli National Security Council.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.